All right, we're going to go ahead and dismiss the kids to Children's Church. So if you've got a little one 2 years old through fourth grade, they can head down to the youth center. Or a little one littler than 2 years old, you're welcome to take them to the nursery. While they're heading out, a couple of things I'll just remind you of. One, you heard Jody talk about on the announcements. It's these little postcards that we have. There's some in each the Welcome Center and the foyer. These are real simple. They just say, you're invited. I love our church, and I think you will too. This may just be someone you have in mind. You want to write a quick, hey, I've been praying for you and your family, and drop it in the mail to them. If there may be events that come along that you'd like to invite them to, you can mail this to them. You can write them a note and hand it to them, or you can give it to us and we'll mail it for you. The most important thing is we want to be inviting people to join what this church is doing, and most importantly, to join them to come and get to know Jesus in his church. That's the goal. Speaking of interesting things or special things you might want to invite somebody to, let me invite you to this. We are doing a marriage seminar in February for people of all ages called the Happy Couple Summit. Now, why the Happy Couple? Why doesn't it say marriage seminar? Back when I was a kid, you could say marriage seminar and people would show up from all over the place to come because everybody wanted to work on their marriage, and I guess nothing was ever more exciting than a seminar to you people. So we worked on branding for this for weeks, and I finally got on Google Analytics and just searched on trends. What are people searching for? And compared to the rest of the country, it shows you all 50 states over the last 12 months, and compared to the rest of the country, if you search for marriage seminar, would you like to guess how Oklahoma stacks up against the other 49 states? Dead last. Nobody is searching for that in Oklahoma. So I thought, well, how about couple seminar? Nope. How about successful marriage? A little bit, but not a lot. And so as I tested phrases against each other, the one that bore out above everything else was happy couple. Not happy marriage, happy couple. Actually, the most successful one was great sex, but we didn't want to brand it that way, so we went with Happy Couple Seminar, Happy Couple Summit. This is a marriage seminar, but as you and I all know, the landscape of our culture has changed. And there's no longer, especially among younger generations, the emphasis on marriage that there used to be. Now, I believe that marriage is a blessing from God. Wow, that was not near men. What were you thinking right there? Every wife that didn't hear an enthusiastic amen is going to pay for that one later. I believe marriage is a blessing from God, but I also know where our culture is. So we're going to meet our culture where it is. We're going to help people develop the relationships that they are in, and as they come to know Jesus, I believe they will then be interested in taking the steps he leads us on. For those of us who are already married, fantastic. It's a marriage seminar. Some of you may not be in a couple, but you might be interested in being in one someday. You're invited too. We're not trying to exclude anybody here, but it's been a long time since our church has done anything this kind of intentional about trying to help people build their marriages up. So that's what we're going to do. And so you'll see a few of these going out on different postcards or on the digital sign over the next few weeks, but we're going to be inviting people to come and join us for the Happy Couple Summit. And I hope, regardless where you are in your relationship, in your marriage, I hope that you'll come and join us. One final thing that I think is cool. We do have Bobby Kern. He's a doctor of family sciences over at Oklahoma Christian University. He's going to be doing our keynote sessions, but then on Saturday morning, we're going to have a couple of breakout sessions as well, following different crash courses. So there's one on couples finances, one on communication, one on parenting, and one on being in a happy relationship once the kids are gone. And that, as what I have learned now from talking to many, many people, is that anytime there's a significant transition in our lives, our marriages and our relationships are at stake. I kept hoping that marriage would be something that someday we no longer had to work on. Turns out you have to work on it all the time. So I hope that you'll come and work on it with us. All right. Grab your Bible and open to the book of 1 Peter. Chapter 2, it's on page 979. We're going to get there in just a second. As you're turning to 1 Peter chapter 2 on page 979 in these Bibles we share, I have a question for you. By a quick show of hands, how many of you have stayed in an Airbnb, a Vrbo, something like that before? Where you stayed in someone else's house, their vacation property? Okay, a lot of us, more than half of us. Okay, think through why you chose where you stayed. You may have done it once, you may have stayed in a whole bunch of them, but why did you choose where you stayed? I typically choose the place that I stay on 3 factors. The first one's cost. But if that's removed or all other things being equal, I'm mostly interested in, will I be comfortable when I sit or lay down? And when I imagine myself in those pictures, do I like the way I feel? It really is pretty much that simple, right? If the beds or couches look uncomfortable, I'm not going. Because the thing I'm going to do there the most is sit or lay down. And after that, I've got to feel good when I visualize myself in those pictures. And then I might ask some follow-up questions of the owner. Maybe you've sent questions like this too. Like, are there things for the kids to do at the house? Because nothing is worse than being on vacation with bored children. Or maybe, is there room for my dogs to run around? Can they stretch their legs? Do you have Netflix? Is there going to be something to watch and to enjoy? These are all questions I've asked before. Now imagine you're getting ready to book that Airbnb and you've already kind of passed that first filter. Imagine if you started sending questions instead of those like, how thick is the foundation of your property? Is the electrical in the house grounded? Was all the work of your most recent construction project or your most recent renovation, was it all done by licensed, bonded, and insured construction workers? This is important to me. If you start sending those kind of questions, the person on the other end is going to do 2 things. They're going to assume that you're insane, and they're going to deny your request to book the property. Because these are not questions that you should be asking. They're not questions that mean anything to you as someone who's going to rent that property, who's going to stay in that house or that apartment. All I want to know is, will I be comfortable and will I enjoy my stay? Because that's all I need to know. I shouldn't care about those things when I rent the house, and I never have once cared about those questions. But do you know who does care how thick the foundation is? Or if the house is grounded? Or if the work was done by licensed, bonded, insured contractors? Do you know who does care about that? The owner of the house. And they should care about that. You know who else cares about it? The bank, who lent the money, who's involved in the project and the quality of their investment. They care a lot because they're invested in it. If you're the temporary visitor, then the visible surface level things, the final product is all you really care about. You're a temporary resident passing through this thing. But if you live in the house, all the stuff you don't see matters a lot. If you ignore the foundation or the wiring or the quality of the work, that's really dangerous if you live there. I think this is true of churches as well. When we look for a church, we start with things like, will my kids enjoy it there? Does it look like they have a fun or engaging children's ministry? Or do they sing the songs that I like? Or do they have the type of music that I like? Do I agree with the preacher because I'm right and he needs to be too? Did they have donuts? Was the coffee good? What's the dress code? Does everything work smoothly? Is it similar to what I experienced growing up? These are all questions that we ask when we're looking for a church. And if you're just in town visiting, that's a great series of questions to ask, all very valid. If the church is something that you go to, church is something that you show up to, then maybe those questions also suffice. But if the church is something that we are and something we belong to, then it's really important to do an inspection to make sure that the things that the church is built on are important too. How do you build a church? Turns out that if you're going to live there, that's some of the most important questions you can ask. And it isn't just true about visitors that they should ask those kind of questions. What is this church built on? How is this church built? Have you ever lived in a house for a long enough time that you got everything fixed up when you moved in, but over time it just kind of started to deteriorate a little bit, but it was inconvenient, or you're real busy? It's something that can wait till later, and so you let it wait till later. Am I the only one in this room who's ever done that to their own house? You guys are like, we do our projects timely. What's the problem? We never procrastinate. Or maybe the problem that showed up was really expensive. You're like, I know I need a new roof, but that's a big investment in this property, and we just don't have it right now. We'll put it off. I'm sure it will be fine until the small little leak becomes a really big leak. Or maybe it's not like a structural problem. It's just a stain. It's just a stain in the carpet. But it's our stain in the carpet. Who cares? It's not hurting anything. The rest of the carpet's fine. And it doesn't really matter if it's your stain in your carpet until you get ready to sell that house to somebody else, huh? And then the stain that you've stepped over for 3 or 4 decades, suddenly the first thing they do is walk in the room and go, whoa, was there a murder here? You're like, no, our 3-year-old spilled grape juice 35 years ago. Even if you've lived in a house for decades, you have to periodically check up to make sure that not just the stuff you see is in good shape, but that the structure is good. And that the house itself is in good working order, and that maybe some of those things need to be cleaned or need to be fixed. Sometimes you do a little inspection and you realize, man, we might even need to remodel some things because it is just aged out, or it has deteriorated, or it's no longer serving the purposes it was created for. If it's been long enough, you might even need to take the house down to the studs. That's what we're doing this year. This year, we're going to spend 2023 taking the church down to the studs to learn how a church is built, to do the inspection, to look behind the drywall, to look at the foundation, to look at how the whole thing is made, to make sure that our church is being built in a healthy way. And that's a weird thing to say, right? And a church that's been around in our community for over 100 years now. I live in a 100-year-old house. It has to regularly be inspected and worked on. And so perhaps does the church. We're going to be looking at the beliefs and practices that build healthy churches. It's not so we can rebuild ourselves into something totally new or different. It's so we can assess and make sure that we're on the right track, that things are still in good working order. It's an opportunity for us to make sure that our church is still built on the right things, walking in line with what God has called his people to. At the beginning of the book of Revelation, there are 7 letters to 7 different churches. And every single one of them has some moment of critique where the Lord has to remind the church there are things that need to be shifted and brought back on track that you can be the church that I have created you and called you to be. They needed to be renovated. That's what we're doing this year at Adams. Now, to be really clear, at the beginning of this thing, it's not going to be an argument for a specific flavor or sect or denomination or theology or ideology. I'm not interested in those things. It's like asking if you're building a ranch house or a mid-century modern house or a colonial house or a container house. Like, it matters, but it's not the most important thing. You can build any of those kinds of houses, but they all have to be built right. We're going to look at the core foundational beliefs that shape us into the people of God. And all those beliefs and actions are going to be in line with Jesus. And so what you see this morning on the stage is definitely unfinished. It's a work in progress. It's the beginning. It's the framing of a set that is going to grow and evolve with us as we build throughout the year. The further we go with this will be an evolving representation of the things that we are learning together, we're studying together, and it will be, I hope, a visual metaphor for where we go with this thing. One little note for our OCD people: it's not symmetrical. They already knew. I'm just telling the rest of you. We know that, but it'll make sense as we go. All right. That's enough setup. Let's jump into the Bible this morning. This morning, as we start this new series, I want us to start with a mantra and a memory verse. The mantra plays in my head and has for over a decade since the first time I heard it. We're going to memorize this together. Say it with me. Orthodoxy leads to orthopraxy. Oh, isn't that just fun? Did you get chill bumps? Say it one more time, and then I'll explain it, okay? Say it with me. Orthodoxy leads to orthopraxy, okay? And this is what that means. Right belief leads to right practice. Say that part with me. Right belief leads to right practice. This is important. Everything that we study and talk about this year it's going to be theological, it's going to be Christological, it's going to be ecclesiological. We're going to go into some deep places, but teaching things without a life application is just usually so much worthlessness. Oh, it's fun. You can argue about beliefs all day long, but if the belief doesn't lead to life application or change, then what exactly is the point? When you look at the Bible, and specifically when you look at Jesus, what you will find is that whenever your beliefs are in the right place, it leads to actions that change you and the world around you. Orthopraxy or orthodoxy leads to orthopraxy. Right belief leads to right practice. So for this entire year, as we dig into what builds a church, when we talk about right belief, it will always have some kind of pointed application to right practice. Now, let's talk about a memory verse together. Let's learn this. We're going to be here for the better part of January. So let's learn this verse together. Say it with me. You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. Say it with me again. You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. Now let's see that verse in context. 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to read verses 4 through 9. You are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. And you are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. What's more, you are his holy priests. Through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you offer spiritual sacrifices that please God. As the scriptures say, I am placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem, chosen for great honor. And anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Yes, you who trust him recognize the honor God has given him. But for those who reject him, the stone the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. And he is the stone that makes people stumble, the rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they do not obey God's word, and so they meet the fate that was planned for them. But you are not like that, for you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. The word of the Lord from 1 Peter chapter 2. This passage is packed with metaphors and hyperlinks. Everything that Peter says there, I mean, literally almost every single sentence is packed with a link to somewhere else. This would be firing off link after link after link to the ears of the people who heard this or who read this letter. They would immediately be making connections that you and I might not make. This was embedded in their culture in ways that it is no longer for us. As an analogy, we have things like this too, right? If I say, with great power, you know to end that with comes great responsibility. Right? It's a callback. As soon as I say, with great power, I don't even have to finish it. You just know. With great power, oh yeah, it comes great responsibility. And you might even know who said that. Uncle Ben. Unless it was the last series of movies, then Aunt May. But Uncle Ben. Sorry, I went down far enough that I lost even the nerds in that one. Sorry. There are just some things like that are callbacks. Peter is doing these callbacks over and over and over again in these verses. You can see some of the metaphors, the idea of the cornerstone or the priesthood or the temple, like we see some of that. But everything he is saying here is connected to prophecies in the Old Testament. This morning, I want to talk about this idea of the cornerstone. What does it mean to be a living cornerstone? Okay, a cornerstone, I think that you know this, but just in case. A cornerstone is the first block that you place when you're building something out of stone. It is the foundation that must be level. It is the thing that squares everything else. Years ago, I was in Honduras building, we would build houses for people who were, until then, just really living in shanties they could throw together from whatever trash they could pick up. And so we would go in and we would then build them like a 12 by 12 square with a sheet tin roof. And it just changed people's lives for real. And the most important thing, the thing that took us the longest part of the project by itself, was the first beam. They didn't really have foundations. It was dirt floor. But that first beam had to be exactly the right height and had to be squared off exactly perfectly. Our ramp building guys do this every time they build a ramp. The cornerstone is the rock. And when you're talking about temples, I mean, these are massive stones. They weigh tens of tons. And they would finally get them into place. And if they were not set exactly level, over time, the whole rest of the building is not only off, but it cracks. It's weak. It will fall down. So for Jesus to be the cornerstone is to square the entire church based on him. I lived in a house one summer called, at an internship, we called it the House of Illusions. It had been built by hand by a guy in South Texas in the late 1800s. And you could stand in the bathroom and you could look out and see the kitchen, the den, the living room, and the entryway. And they all leaned different directions. And you could stand in this bathroom and it would make you dizzy. This house maybe had been built level at the time, but it wasn't on a foundation. And so over time, it had shifted and cracked, and everything leaned in different directions. Peter says that Jesus is the cornerstone of the church. He is true level for his followers. Okay, that's the easy metaphor. But he's not just doing a metaphor here, he's doing a hyperlink. And he's hyperlinking to the prophet Isaiah. This is from Isaiah chapter 26. Hear what the prophet says to a people who have been in rebellion. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I'm placing a foundation stone in Jerusalem, a firm and tested stone. It is a precious cornerstone that is safe to build on. Whoever believes need never be shaken. I will test you with the measuring line of justice and the plumb line of righteousness. Since your refuge is made of lies, a hailstorm will knock it down. Since it's made of deception, a flood will sweep it away. In this passage, it's kind of a two-part deal. The first part is written about one who will come and to the one who will come. I will test you with the measuring line of justice and the plumb line of righteousness. This part is to the one who will be the cornerstone. This is how you will know that the cornerstone has arrived, that God will measure them with the measuring line of justice and the plumb line of righteousness. The second part here is judgment towards the elders of Israel at the time, those who have chosen their own path, tried to make their own way right, and as a result, they have a bad foundation. They've been unjust. This is what's getting condemned in the rest of this passage. The idea of the measuring line of justice and the plumb line of righteousness would be helpful as we build a church to know what those two terms mean. The measuring, test you with the measuring line of justice. Justice in the Old Testament is making sure that people who cannot take care of themselves are taken care of. That's why widows and orphans always come out as the sign of true religion, both in the Old Testament and the New. All right, it's not about do the bad people get what's coming to them. It's about are those who cannot take care of themselves being taken care of by God's people. That's what justice is. So the cornerstone himself and the church built upon that cornerstone must have justice at its core, biblical justice, to take care of those people who are in need. And then you have the plumb line of righteousness. Righteousness, as we have defined it, as the Bible defines it, is proactive peacemaking between God and people and each other, and people in God's creation. It's restoring the peace of God's good world. And so when these people are measured, when the standard for first the cornerstone and then the church built on the cornerstone is this: do you care about those who cannot care for themselves? And number two, are you working within yourself and within the community around you to bring peace to a chaotic world? Which is why when Jesus shows up and starts teaching in Matthew chapter 5, these are immediately the themes that show up. Matthew chapter 5 on page 774, if you want to follow along. You know this passage, I hope. But as Jesus does the preamble to his Sermon on the Mount, here's how he starts. Blessed, or God blesses those who are poor in spirit, realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. He blesses those who hunger and thirst for righteousness or justice. This is the same word in Greek. For they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And he blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right off the bat in the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus hones in on is justice for those who have been overlooked or trampled by society, and an emphasis on righteousness in the way that we treat one another. God says, here's the measuring stick I'm going to use. Here's what's coming for you, Jerusalem, for my people. I'm going to create a foundation stone that will level everybody who are my people. It's going to be focused on justice and righteousness. And when Jesus shows up, he says, let me tell you what God wants. It's justice and righteousness. And the rest of the Gospels are explaining how Jesus brought those things to the people around him. And so when Peter now will reference who Jesus is and what Jesus was prophesied, what he hones in on is this: Jesus is our cornerstone. He says this prophecy was fulfilled in Jesus. And he says Jesus is not just a cornerstone. What kind of cornerstone is he? Look back in that passage. Jesus isn't just a cornerstone. He is, what does it say? You're coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone. And that makes all the difference. It's easy to build a church on things that are static. It's easy, when you build a house, you better hope that your cornerstone is static, that it doesn't move. If your cornerstone moves, you're in trouble. But Jesus is a living cornerstone. And what Peter is saying here is that on the one hand, Jesus came in the flesh. He lived among us, and he's been resurrected. He is alive. But there's a difference between what God's people and God's religious practice had been built on before in the temple itself. That was the Torah. There was a building where you went to do these rules and practice these specific regulations. But Jesus is the living cornerstone. His way is now a way that can be embodied and lived out in the world among people in the world. You no longer have to go to a place to be a Jesus follower. If you were a Jew, you had to go to the temple to perform the sacrifices and the rites and the rituals. But now, because of Jesus, he is the living cornerstone, and you can live out his way wherever you are. Jesus' morals are unchanging. His lifestyle, though, is infinitely adaptable, because focusing on justice and righteousness can happen in any group of people, in any time and place. And then Peter says that when people encounter Jesus, one of two things happens. Look what it says in verse 6. I'm placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem, chosen for great honor. This is Isaiah. Anyone who trusts him will never be disgraced. But also, the stone the builders has rejected has now become the cornerstone. He is the stone that makes people stumble, the rock that makes them fall. Peter says when people encounter Jesus, one of two things happens. You either trust him, or you stumble and fall. Why would people stumble and fall on Jesus? I don't know that I've ever met a person who said, I don't like Jesus, or I don't respect Jesus, or I don't admire Jesus. Why would Jesus make someone stumble and fall? And Jesus wasn't really one to deal harshly with people, was he? We spent basically half of last year looking at Jesus chapter by chapter in Matthew. The only people he ever dealt harshly with were religious, self-righteous people. So then why would Jesus be the thing that people fall on? So the opposite of righteousness is the word iniquity. The word iniquity means to be so bent that the whole culture around you becomes corrupt. There are no straight angles anymore. It's now all off-center and bent. Have you ever, you ever got on the floor to play with a little kid, and then you tried to stand up, and you started making dad noises, ugh. And then you stand up and you go, I'm just going to sit back down for a second. If you fold and you're bent for long enough, it hurts to straighten out. This is what the world experiences all the time, because when you run into Jesus, he is a level cornerstone. He sits at perfect angles. He is the one who shows you what righteousness and justice look like. And when you run into him, it's like standing on true level for the first time. And if your whole life has been lived in a bent and unjust and unrighteous society, sometimes the process of straightening out hurts. And it might be easier just to sit back down and get back into that bent shape for a little while. This is why Jesus trips people up. He gives us a standard. He makes demands, and people don't want that. I had a friend his name is Nick. We learned to ski together. We learned to ski together in Colorado one spring break on Keystone Mountain. Keystone Mountain has a bunny slope, and then there is a lift that goes all the way to the top of the mountain. So we started on the bunny slope. It's a wise place to start. We tried the bunny slope one time. The bunny slope has these little lift chairs. It's not a big chair that you sit in that takes you up the mountain. It's basically a pole with a disc about this big. And as it comes, you're supposed to grab it and then sit on it on your skis, and it takes you up the mountain. So I get up in line, and I grab the pole, and I sit on it, and it takes me right up the mountain. And I get about 15 yards up, and I hear, "Ah! Let go!" My buddy Nick had grabbed the pole, sat on it. It surprised him and goosed him, which made him lose his balance, and he fell. But instead of falling, he held on to the pole, and it drags him up the bunny slope. So he's screaming, and they're screaming at him, "Let go!" The entire week was going to be like this. We got up to the top of the bunny slope, and we went down one time. And in that one trip down the bunny slope, we almost killed a dozen children. Because they're doing slow, pizza, french fries. Like they're learning to ski. We don't have an instructor. We just went up, and now we're coming down. And one of us couldn't even ride the ski lift correctly. And so as these children weave in and out, we are screaming and trying not to hurt someone. So we get to the bottom of the hill, and we go, "We can't do that again. Let's just go to the top and see what happens." And so we did. We got to the top of this big, long green. It's about a mile run by the time it gets to the bottom of the mountain. And we got up there, and it looked way higher and way steeper from up there than it did at the bottom. And so we pointed our skis, and we went. And the way this hill worked was fairly steep. I mean, it's a green, but it's still fairly steep if you've never done this before. And then it kind of flattens out and it turns. And so we fall down this hill for probably 15 or 20 minutes as we're just trying. We don't make it very far. We just get up and fall over and get up and fall over. And after an hour and a half of getting up and falling over, we're almost ready to be able to actually sort of ski. And so then I finally get the hang of it one time, and I go the rest of the way down this hill to where it flattens out. But I've kind of figured out how to just like pizza and go slowly as I get there. And I get to where it levels out, and I stop. And once again from behind me, I hear, "Ah!" Nick has not learned to pizza. He hasn't really even learned to turn. And so he finally got himself upright, and his skis are like this, and he is flying down the mountain, and he can't stop. Now, he's fine as long as he's going like this. But then the ground levels off, and he goes from here to flat, and he goes, "Oh," and falls over, and his skis explode, and they fly right at my face. I'm still here, guys. It couldn't have ended that badly. Like something out of the Matrix. I slow-mo and block these skis as they go by. It was incredible. And then I look, and it's Nick, the human snowball, who tumbles into me and knocks me over. It's not the hill that got Nick. He figured out how to go down. The problem came when the momentum shifted from this to this. When the ground leveled is what took him out. This is what happens to people when they encounter the real Jesus. I'm not talking about religion that tells you you can be happy or that your life can be the easiest it's ever been. When you encounter the real Jesus who cares about real life, it is like going from this to level. And some people, when they hit that, all they know how to do is collapse and crumble. You can trip on the living cornerstone. Even Christians who have been in church for a long time can trip on the living cornerstone. Because when you stop caring about all the things that we want and we start caring about the things that Jesus cares about, true level is deeply uncomfortable sometimes. And so Jesus is the cornerstone that makes people stumble and fall when they reject him. I've got to hit this question, because it is the obvious question that I get asked a lot by people who are wrestling with faith. Why can't I just be a good person? A lot of Jesus' stuff are taught in other religions too. Why can't I just be a good person? Isn't that good enough? And my follow-up question is always this: who gets to define good? It's fine to ask, why can't I just be a good person? But based on what standard? Who gets to decide? You? Me? What if our standards are different? This is the world we live in, the world of moral relativism, where I will do what is right for me as long as it isn't hurting anybody else. Hurting anybody else based on what? How far of a radius of hurt do we get to go? What we see all around us right now is the moral chaos of a culture that has dived straight headfirst into iniquity and said, we'll just all make up our own morality as we go. And how's that working out? It leads to people being hurt. So using, from my, I was going to say my money, but really it's from my life. Using the standards of justice and righteousness that Jesus shows us are the best good that I have found. No one does it better than Jesus. And so as the apostles began building the church, this is where they started, and it's where we have to start as well. Jesus is the cornerstone. Or if I can mix the metaphor just a little bit, Jesus is the foundation of this church that we are building. He is the true level. We're going to see if I can slide this without hurting myself. Jesus is the foundation upon which everything else has to be built. He's the thing the church stands on. Now, in some ways, this seems self-evident, so I've got to step one more step into the hot water. Because everybody says that they're built on Jesus and something. Our church is built on Jesus and this creed. Our church is built on Jesus and this pastor. Our church is built on Jesus and the Pope. Our church is built on Jesus and the example of the early church. Now, any of those things by themselves, I'm not interested in arguing about. Because it's not a question of whether or not those other things might be helpful or beneficial to a church. The question is, what is the church built on? And it cannot be Jesus and something else. The church is only built on Jesus. He is the foundation. And then everything else the church uses in ways that make it healthier are more like the studs on the walls. This may be splitting hairs, but they're hairs that we have to split at the beginning of this because we want our church to be the healthiest church it can be. I'm not saying that any of those other things might not be healthy or good for us, but they are not the foundation for us. You can have a problem with studs, and studs can periodically be pretty easy to replace if you have to in-house, but if the foundation is messed up, you're in real trouble. And so I would suggest to you that our only foundation, the only appropriate foundation for the church forever is Jesus Christ. This is another way of doing what Paul says when he says that Paul is the head of or that Jesus is the head of the church. It's another way of saying the same thing, right? We're just not using the body metaphor. This year, we use the building metaphor. Last thought. This is important for the church because for a long time, I don't think our congregation, but the church culture around us, the Christian culture, the popular Christian culture around us, has said there's a whole bunch of things that you build your idea of faith on. Like, if God's a good God of love, then he wants you to be happy. And so I choose what's right or wrong for me based on my happiness because, of course, God's going to be on board with me, right? If I don't feel guilty about it, it must not be wrong. Isn't that what the Holy Spirit does, is make me feel guilty? So if the Holy Spirit's not guiding me away from this, then I think the Holy Spirit wants me to do these things. Or my other Christian friends support it. My church supports it. It feels right to me. Who cares? For Christians, the only foundation we ever have and can ever have is Jesus Christ himself. When you trust in Jesus, though, something amazing happens. We talked about why people will stumble or fall when they run into Jesus. But that's not who Peter's writing to, and that's not who I'm talking to this morning either. Look back one more time at verse 4. He says, you are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. Yeah, he was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. And these people are not the people who have rejected Christ. These are the people who are now coming to him. You are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. What's more, you are his holy priests through the mediation of Jesus Christ. You offer spiritual sacrifices that please God. As the scriptures say, I am placing a cornerstone in Jerusalem, chosen for great honor, and anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. This is the good news of this passage. That those who trust in Jesus, for the church that is built on the foundation of Jesus Christ, we will never be disgraced. In a time when our culture has largely turned away from Christianity and in a lot of ways is now turning back with teeth out and claws bared, we will never be disgraced. When following Jesus means going against the grain, you will never be disgraced. You will not stumble and fall. You will find a place of hope and safety and love. I want to end with a question this morning. It's a question that I hope you'll discuss with your small groups tonight, even if it's just as an intro to whatever else you're studying. But here's a question for you to discuss tonight. Reflect on it now and talk about it later. In your life right now, is your life in line with Jesus, or are you building on some other foundation? Is Jesus one of the things that support your life, or is he the thing that your whole life is built on? That is a strong question for reflection together. My prayer for us is that this year, as we work through this theme together, that we will find our church built more and more on only the foundation of Jesus. The theme for the year is church building. Obviously, that's a play on words. But in the way we're using it, you know what a synonym is for church building, for building a church? The synonym is discipleship. Everything that we talk about this year is going to be building us up as disciples. If we can love you or pray for you this morning, if we can help you get back on track with Jesus, would you let us know as we stand and sing together? Jesus.